back to this latest episode of Japan's top business interviews. I'm your host, Dr. Greg Story, the president of Dale Carnegie Training, Tokyo, Japan. And my special guest today is an old friend of mine, Kenji Kowalas, who is one of the leaders at Bain & Company, a global brand name in consulting. So, Kenji, tell us a little bit about how is it that you are here running, or working with, I should say, some of the other leaders to run Bain in Japan. And how did you get here and what have you been doing here?
First, good to see you again, Greg, after all these years, It's always good to be with you. And hopefully, during this talk we have today, we can probably, share some thoughts about, how to be a leader in Japan. And look, I've been in this country, I would say, for almost as long as I can remember, because if you ask me when did I arrive in Japan, I won't be able to give you a specific date because I'm half Japanese, half French. And I've been going back and forth between the two countries, actually, ever since I was born. So obviously, a lot of affection and a lot of love for this country. I would say that the last time I came here in a relatively big way was actually more than 20 years ago, after a stint in the US. Actually, I can explain later. So yes, I'm actually, I don't know how you call this, an old hand in Japan or a hysteric fan of the country, I don't know. But I've been around for a little bit of time and enjoying it, every day.
I understand you've got roots in France, you've got roots in Japan, you're traveling, families coming, to and fro. But professionally, when did you come back to Japan to work?
So I actually started my career in the bubble economy in Japan. And those who obviously remember those days, they were a very different time and different way of doing business back in those days. We're talking about, 87, 88, the end of the Showa area. That was actually my first stay here in Japan. And then I thought,
When you were back at that time during the bubble, what were you doing here?
So I was a sales engineer working for a joint venture that we can talk about later on, because there's definitely a very specific topic when it comes to joint ventures between a French company and a Japanese company. And I was a sales engineer. I worked here for like 2 or 3 years. And actually I left Japan for 2 reasons. First is because I didn't think that, sales was necessarily a career for me in the long term. That was actually point number 1. Point number 2 is I didn't want to be, stereotyped as being kind of the Japanese guy working for foreign corporations. And I was a young guy, I was basically 24, 5. And so I just felt I had a lot of things to learn. And, working in a bubble economy, and people were kind of actually aware of it. Actually, it was interesting. Is good, but you get pretty bad habits sometimes. So it was just better to leave Japan, which I did a few years later. Then I went back to France for a few years, and I moved to consulting.
What did you go from in France to move to consultant?
So I'm sure there's some psychiatrists who might think that, okay, if you are kind of between cultures, you might want to consider a job that gives you, a lot of different view or perspective on a single problem or on a single issue. And I think that's part of the thing that attracted me in consulting is that, at the end of the day, you work with a set of data, facts and figures, and you're trying to come up with a story that may not be the story that your client has actually in their mind because, again, over time, you're just a little bit in the routine of the business. So, I think what attracted me into consulting is that, you start with a fresh look on a given industry, on a given company. And then you're basically asking the questions about, is that really what your business is? Is it really what your business is supposed to be? And is that what the kind of directions you want your business to be? And that's what attracted me to consulting. Like most of the young guys usually that start consulting, it's about, I'm going to do this like 4 or 5 years and I'll see what would happen next. And I kind of liked it. So, and the reason I liked it is because I think, the firm was quite skilled as giving every 5 or 6 years new opportunities to do. So 5 years.
So when you say about the firm, when you first go into consulting, who are you doing it with?
So I was working for another firm called Mars & Co. Before Bain. A very interesting firm in a way that was of French heritage, but a very strong operation in the US. And 5 years after I joined Mars, and we're talking about 94, 95, there was this opportunity to opening an office in San Francisco. And for someone who's French Japanese going to the US, actually, believe it or not, and going to San Francisco was not an attractive proposition, actually. And when I think about it, it's kind of interesting because, I would go back to San Francisco any day, even today. But there was this idea that, especially if you've been educated in a French system, which is the case for me, as you can tell in how I speak English, there was this kind of, the American of doing business is different from the European way of doing business. And I would say that some people actually didn't find that very attractive. And I had fell into that trap in many ways. So, when the first time they told me, okay, what about going to San Francisco? I was like, really? But obviously, that's what happens when you're young. You're not supposed to have.
So you're going from France to San Francisco?
So yeah, that was in 1994, 95, going to San Francisco, opening a new office. And of course, 94, 95, we didn't know that something big would happen in the late 90s in the Bay Area. Up an office there. And it was really mostly about business development, actually. It was not so much about consulting per se. It was just finding new clients at the end of the day. And trying to... and that's, that's how you learn to... there's always a plan when you actually start a new business or a new office. In that case, it was actually a new office. But at the end of the day, it's about also being opportunistic. So, we had these plans about here are the kind of the key clients we're going to be targeting. That's the kind of product we're going to be offering as consulting firm. And of course, none of that happened. At the end of the day, none of that happened because the clients we got actually were introduction of someone. Actually, we had worked well with some before. And it was actually, I was spending many, many weeks, believe it or not, in New York, not in California, actually. In Europe? Sorry, New York State.
New York, right.
In New York State, we had a big client actually based in Rochester, of all things, so very far from California. But again, you just go where the business is. And I think the last thing I would just say about the experience is that it taught me that opportunistic element, the fact that at the end of the day, it's about execution, it's not necessarily about planning. And then just be open, because after I spent 5 years in California, I was converted. I was converted. I didn't want to go back to France.
So you say you were converted, but what does that mean? You became American, or you just thought the Anglo-Saxon business model is superior to La France or something? What were you thinking?
Well, obviously, I was in a very privileged environment, I would say, because California is obviously, of all places, quite inviting to a lot of different profile. I would say that also, it wasn't so much the American way of doing business, because I don't want to get into the debate about, what's good or bad about that. But I was converted, so I guess you probably know what I'm thinking. But I think it was probably the first time in my life when I saw an extremely diverse environment. And what I mean by diversity is not just about gender diversity and different countries and citizenship. It was more about also diversity of thinking when it comes to business. Okay, and it's true that when you're coming from Europe or in Japan, and again, back then I was just in my early 30s, so I didn't know too much anyway. There was a certain view about what the business is like. There was a certain view about what are the rules of the business. There was a certain view about these are the kind of people who are going to be succeeding because these are the kind of people they are. And then you go back, not go back, you go to California, and obviously everything is kind of upside down, and you see different examples, you see different experiences. So I think that was really what I took away from my experience in California. And again, the fact that obviously that was the beginning of what's this huge wave, which is obviously still going on in terms of online and digital, didn't hurt as well, because then you come across a variety of profile and about talent, which is extremely invigorating and very encouraging, actually.
So what happens after San Francisco? You come back to Japan, or do you go somewhere else?
Yeah, so it's interesting because the way I view it is, it's either coming back to Japan or just continuing on my trip, going against the Gulf Stream, so to speak, in many ways, because I started my career in Japan, as I said. I went to France, so basically flying west, and then from France flying west again to go to San Francisco, and then going to Japan again. That was in '99 when I opened the Tokyo office of Mars & Co. But it's an interesting question you ask, because I think, for people of my profile, and it's always about, are you going back or are you going forward? Are you? And it's just it's always something which is going in people's mind, I would say. But yes, I think it was interesting because Japan in '99 was a very different place from Japan in '89, which is the time when I left it. I also thought, as I said earlier, that I had a little bit of experience working so that I would not necessarily be stereotyped as the Japanese guy working in foreign corporations. So, I had a little bit of credentials, so to speak, that gave me a lot of confidence in terms of what I can do and what I still have to improve, I would say. And the opportunity in '99 was actually to open an office in Tokyo.
So they didn't have an operation. They're going to set up something in Japan, and you're the guy that gets front and center.
That's right. And honestly, I don't think I would have been able to do the same thing 10 years earlier. Because, not so much because I was younger, of course, because I was younger, but also because I thought, I would have come with a bit of an expectation that, okay, well, he's a Japanese guy doing this in Japan, so that's going to be okay. Well, no, actually, it's not going to be okay because just he's Japanese, half Japanese. And so I think it was quite important for me to have a little bit of, experience under my belt, as you say, I guess, and 10 years of consulting.
Mars is probably well known outside of Japan. Probably wasn't that well known inside of Japan. McKinsey, I think everyone knows Kenichi Omai was running McKinsey at the time. They know Boston Consulting, Bain, of course. These are all big competitor names. Mars, probably not known so well. So when you're trying to establish an office here, how do you convince sharp, intelligent, talented younger people to join your crew and go after big clients? How do you do that?
Yeah, and it's in my that's the key question, actually. That's the key question is how do you actually communicate on a vision which is compelling enough so that people will just join you, And I would say actually in Japan is not really that different from other countries, other than that sometimes you have to deal not only with the person that you're talking to, but also you're dealing with, I would say, the extended family that sometimes has a say in that decision process. I'll give you an example. When we're trying to hire some people who are basically aged between, age of 22 to 28, just for the sake of, so basically young people, extremely capable people coming from all the great university. I remember actually many discussions when the person actually who wanted to join my team was saying, look, I'm convinced I'm with you, great. Can you talk to my parents? I'm like, what? That's not necessarily something I was expecting, So yeah, there's a little bit about Japan in that, you have to do a little bit of your nemawashi, I would say, almost.
And sometimes the grandparents as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's depending on the definition of the extended family, I think, that you have to face. And honestly, I never took it as a chore or something like, which is really painful to do. I found it relatively, I wouldn't say funny, but original, I would say. Most of the time, actually, it was a positive thing. So, actually, it was more like an investment for the future as well. So that at least, the parents they knew actually what kind of places their son or their daughter were getting into. But back to, to the candidates. So, how you attract such candidate? How you, I think it's, you have to be a little bit innovative in your recruiting strategy. So obviously recruiting from the top schools, because they're, it's part of the selection process, and obviously you have a great number of people in the top schools. But you also look at things like programs which are a bit less known. You look at some specialty that you tend to you appreciate a bit more. So, for example, we're actually looking at people with a very strong engineering background, for example, right? And we're getting the level of attention that they would not necessarily get in some other larger firms where obviously, it's about, finding a little bit of the slightly independent-minded people who, would have gone to these huge, recruiting events done by large firms and were not necessarily attracted by that kind of atmosphere and just were looking at. So it's more about, finding the people, I would say.
Most of those big consulting firms, in my experience, they have like a cookie cutter approach almost, top school, graduate MBA from another top school, consulting. It seems to be very specific that if you want to get into consulting, you've got to have an MBA, but you've got an MBA from the right school and get the whole thing going there. You need to have graduated from the right undergraduate. So are you saying that you will not necessarily find that cookie cutter pattern, but you were looking into graduates from, I'll make this up, let's say archaeology, for example, who are very good at research, a lot of ability to deal with complexity, can scale things over time, complete things together in unique ways. For example, was it more that, or were these people all also MBAs that you were looking for? Was it we only hire MBAs? How was it?
Sure. There were two things. I mean, there was obviously an emphasis on engineering, and part of these we're actually looking at those who were a little bit like they had a relatively high sense of what I would call lateral thinking. So you get this in the interviews. But the second thing also, more pragmatically, is also we're actually looking at some masters. Master's degree that were not necessarily, the traditional hunting ground of some of the firms, But again, I was like, I'm talking about like 20 years ago now. If you look actually at what you call the very large consulting companies, of which obviously Bain is one of, over the years we're getting quite creative, actually, tapping into that kind of different profiles, actually. So we've had actually people who've been in master's degree, sometimes PhD. We've been looking at also more specialized skill set as well. And yes, still looking at, at the very, the top schools, but, with a profile which are a little bit slightly different, and also with I wouldn't say higher qualification, but more history in the academic field. But you would say it's a good problem to have. I think the industry of consulting is actually it's a blessed one in many ways that we have actually quite a few candidates who actually are willing to definitely consider that in many, many more ways than we were 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Consulting is one of the top choice of actually the undergrads and the grads.
I find that interesting because, you've got the Yutori Sedai relaxed education system in place for a long time, where that concept was, cramming raw data in your mind through memorization doesn't really fit the internet age, where you can find anything with a few clicks of a mouse. So therefore, let's take that down a little bit. Let's try and have more creativity and have more innovation, a bit more lateral thinking in our educational system, which they tried. I forget how many years and then they gave up. As soon as the PISA scores came down for maths, science or whatever, they panicked and dumped it. But you do have that generational thing, though. I find where younger people have got quite different mentality around work. And my impression of the consulting business is extremely hard work, long hours, working on projects with severe timelines, sort of a Siberian salt mine for PhDs and master's degrees. How is it? So it has a lot of that, I imagine, attached to it. So how do you find getting the younger generation to sign on for this is quite a rough and tough world of consulting?
It's interesting. I don't think they view it as a rough and tough world, actually. I mean, they know the working hours and stuff like that. And by the way, I think in that field, there's been an incredible level of improvement over the years, actually. But we can talk about that later on. But, I think there's always an element when we hire our young people that they're extremely attracted by this concept of working on projects. And it's actually quite related to the innovation agenda actually in this country, but the idea that, I want to be working in an environment which is not routine. I'm going to work in an environment where, kind of every 3, 6, 9 months, I'm going to work on something totally different from one project to the other. I'm going to have the kind of intellectual stimulation about working in different type of experience and working with different people. It's actually extremely attractive for a young person because, there's always, everyone is always every individual is a balance of two extremes. So one of them is obviously security, comfort zone, I want to know what I'm going to do, and so it's a human nature. And there's always another element about I want to do new things. And I think consulting comes at an age group, between 22, 28, whatever, where people in that pendulum, they definitely not necessarily want to go into the routine phase right away. They may go there at some point of time, but they're not in that mindset. So that's basically, the value proposition actually is that, 3 years in consulting is going to be the same as 7 years in corporate life because you're just going to live on this kind of accelerated dog years kind of work environment. And they don't mind too much about the working hard. Of course they do, but, it's becoming a bit of a secondary I would say, choice. The second thing we've seen also in our young recruit is that they are extremely attentive, I would say, conscious about the people they be working with. And this has been actually a trend over time. And sometimes it's being viewed as work-life balance kind of debate, but I don't necessarily believe that's just about work-life balance and number of hours. It's more about I'm going to be inspired by the people I'm working with, both at my level, the direct supervisor to whom I'm reporting, and as well as the leadership team. And a lot of our young recruits are coming to Bain or other consulting firms, and that's a major criteria. They want actually to understand the kind of people they'll be working with. They want to understand the kind of diverse environment. So they're not actually looking for people from the same university or the same school. I mean, some of them are, of course, looking for some extent, but they also want to actually understand the diversity of the pool of people that we have, so that they're going to get the kind of stimulation as well. And it's happening in Japan as well, actually. And it's quite encouraging when it comes to actually to this country. So that's also the kind of people that we're trying to get.
If you want to be successful as a leader, do the Leadership Training for Managers course. All companies need people who can both manage and lead. Leading people screams out for real skills in communication, dealing with all different types of people, being excellent at innovation, planning, delegation, handling mistakes, doing performance reviews really well, and inspiring and motivating the team. Do the Leadership Training for Managers course now in either Japanese or English. So, when did you move from Mars to Bain? Was that while you were in Tokyo?
Yeah, exactly. So, back to now we in basically 2009-10. So I had been in Japan for 10 years and decided actually to move to Bain. And that was about 12 years ago now. For basically...
Is Mars still functioning?
Yeah, of course. I think it was quite important for me, by the way, that, it was done in the right conditions and that, the sustainability of the operations, I would say, here in Japan was assured. And I felt quite confident that the team that I built there was actually sustainable. So it was also a good timing. And in many ways, I think that, it was also good for them because it was good to have a new leadership team as well. So, I think it was done in a proper way. And then I joined Bain, which was an extraordinary team of people as well, and has been basically the same for the last 12 years in Japan.
So Mars is coming out of a French background, culture, language, it's global. Bain is coming out of an American culture, English, global. What did you find about the types of people who go to a Bain compared to someone who go to a non-Bain or a non-McKinsey or a non-Boston or whatever? Are they basically, all these people are sort of interchangeable? or is like a cultural thing around Bain that is quite specific, that's very attractive for people to join that company?
Yeah, I think, what we've seen over the years is, and by the way, that's not just about what our young recruits tell us, it's also what our clients tell us, is that they're attracted by Bain because, again, there's this little something, this kind of a secret sauce about the people working at Bain. It's about, humility. It's about having a bit of a, this kind of a challenger spirit. It's about, doing something a little bit different, a bit edgy, I would say. And that's the kind of people that, tend to be attracted by Bain. And also, as I said earlier, it's about, they will actually, it's quite interesting, but, they will actually have an extremely high, level of expectation on the culture. And what I mean the culture is that, it's really about work collaboration, it's about it's distributed leadership, it's about being very, very much involved very, very quickly, almost regardless at the age at which you join into the decision-making process and so on and so forth, and collaborating with clients. So there's really about, Bain is actually quite well known for the cultural component of the company.
As one of the leaders there, how do you make that culture happen? Cultures don't happen just because I wish we had a nice culture. You actually have to make that culture. What do you do inside the company, you and your senior colleagues, to establish that culture, maintain that culture, or even have that culture evolve? What do you do about that?
So, I know it's becoming a bit of a stereotype, but, obviously, it's, well, we're in the people business, right? Especially in consulting, by the way, because we don't have any factories or trucks or these kind of things. And the way that we build the culture is basically we say, hey, the purpose of the business, in many ways, is actually to change the industry of our client, but also to help you grow as a person. And all the things that we basically do internally in the operations of our business is centered around people. I'll give you a few examples. So, for example, when we make what we call staffing decisions, so because we basically staff people on specific projects every, let's say, 6 months, okay? We look at a couple of variables, obviously, about, is that person's going to be a good fit for that industry, or is it going to be, coming with the right level of expertise? But also one of the key elements of our staffing model is actually to look at that person, where he or she is in his career, and what kind of project he or she actually needs at that point. Some people need projects which are a little bit more analytical. Some people need projects which are a little bit more like, about client collaboration. So depending on that, actually, we're going to be having a staffing model that really put people at the center of what we decide.
Just on that point, can you, one of those things we notice in our classes, we do have a lot of engineers. We get a lot of analytical sent to us, and they've been sent to us for specific reasons. They're great with numbers. They're not great with people. They're great with analytical skills. They're not great with communication skills. And so we tend to have programs for engineers, analytical types, to help them learn how to deal better with people. Because today, they're often with the client. Once upon a time, maybe they had them, out in the back room beavering away on the numbers, but today they're going with the salesperson to the client. Engineers are going to the client, going to the Gemba, going to where the action is. And so we see that. So how do you deal with that? Because again, I'm sure you need the full package. You need people you can put in front of the client as a consultant who can also be highly analytical, but also be very skilled in communication skills and people skills. How do you get that balance right?
Yeah, so, when we recruit people at the age of 22, yes, as you said, there's some of them are a little bit more on the analytical side, some are a bit more on the client side, but no one is coming with a perfect package. So it's actually the responsibility of the organization actually to put them into situations, where they would actually learn with their direct supervisor about how to be better at what they are a bit less comfortable doing, And so it's actually the job of the organization actually to, in many ways, stretch them, and that's actually a process that never ends. Actually, it never ends, actually, even at my age, Actually, that's one of the things that, these very large professional service firms, I think, do quite well, is that it is always this mindset that you never stop learning, actually. You never stop learning, and you learn not from a textbook, but you learn from basically watching others doing what they do well. You learn by basically being put into situations where you actually have to do it yourself, and then you learn from the experience actually. And the job of this organization is to give these people the opportunity actually to do so. And that's part of the culture actually. It's part of the culture to say, hey, no one's got a perfect answer. But the company, the organization will give you all these situations when you will actually be learning and from looking at what others are doing quite well.
I was interested to...
I had some dealings with a big global law firm, and I'm trying to sell them on training, obviously. I was astounded. They were talking about internally, they had pitch classes for junior level lawyers, and they had different levels of pitch class for senior lawyers, and they were going through that sort of educational package internally. It was pretty impressive. I thought to myself, wow, oh my God. I was just wondering, it's interesting because lawyers similarly often don't think of themselves as salespeople. I'm a lawyer. I give you legal advice. But they're all competing ferociously with each other. So they actually are selling. And I think this particular firm had worked that part out. And they're actually providing a type of training to do that. How about in the case of the consulting industry? Are people sort of sitting back going, well, thank you very much. I'm extremely brainy and I'm extremely experienced, extremely well educated. And you just give me a problem and I'll come up with a really good solution for you and not actually having to go and sell the firm. Is there that component that people are coming to you, or so you're taking orders, or are you actually having to go out there and compete with McKinsey and Boston and all these other characters for a business? How does that work?
Yeah, so I'm not going to say that, of course, we are not salesmen or we don't sell. We are in the business, obviously, so there's a selling component impact. We don't necessarily view it as selling, actually, in professional firms. And I don't know about your lawyers, but, there's always there's a constant dialogue with the client. And that dialogue is usually over many months, sometimes over many, many years. And as part of that dialogue, obviously, there are things that we do together. And sometimes there are things that we do not do together, right? And, as you would obviously quite well know, that the first rule of selling is actually to listen. And we tend to be... So yes, we have actually training classes at all level about how to listen, or some people call it Socratic selling or whatever you want to call it. But, so it is, but we don't necessarily view it as a selling skill. It's more about a dialogue, or I would say just having this client communication skill, so to speak, right? And the idea there, it's really about pattern recognition, actually. In consulting, there's a lot about pattern recognition. It's pattern recognition in terms of understanding the industry, understanding a given problem, because actually that's something that, remember, we dealt with 5 years ago in this industry in these kind of situations. The same with actually client dialogue. You have also this kind of a pattern recognition. Now, it's interesting that you also mentioned this topic about, what kind of skills basically are we, teaching or training people for. And the consulting world, especially the strategy consulting, has been dealing with this issue for quite some years now, because, every, let's say, 5, 6, 7 years, there's always a big wave saying, okay, you know what? Being a generalist is basically your dad's consulting, right? It's basically all these consultants in the older generation, they were all generalists, they can talk about everything, but they were not getting very, very deep. Therefore, now it's going to be age of the specialist. Now you have to have some kind of extremely strong, deep, and every kind of you have this cycle about now, generalist over, specialist is in, and then and then you realize actually it's not that simple. You realize that actually you're actually dealing with business owners, you're dealing with CEOs, you're dealing with head of, and they don't want to hear another specialist telling you that actually the latest solution coming from such and such IT solution is actually the best one. They want actually to have a discussion about their business, their people, their challenges, their opportunities. A holistic perspective. So it's kind of back and forth, right? It's about so when are you specialist, when are you generalist? And I think it's a bit of a forced debate, to be honest with you. I think it's also about combining the two.
One of the big issues of having a very good culture, having a very good internal development system through quality peers, quality supervisors, is that our people become very attractive to competitors. And so one of the issues for all companies in this war for talent that we're in, again, I remember that article, and there was a Harvard Business Review on that. That was in the 90s, called The War for Talent. And we're back at this again here in Japan with the declining population, less and less young people going overseas to study English and become immersed in foreign cultures. they want to stay here in Japan and enjoy Japan. They've got a limited pool of people who are going to be possibly interested in, and so that's the war for talent. How do you keep people in the company and don't allow the competitors to poach them? What do you do about that? How do you keep that engagement? How do you build the trust? What can you do to basically keep yourself intact without seeing a brain drain of talent moving out the door?
Yeah, so you talk about trust. Okay, so let's start with this one. At the end of the day, it's about commitment. If you commit to the mission, and if you actually behave like you actually fully committed to the mission, people actually will trust you. They will listen to you. And then you're going to be one of the options in terms of I'm going to stay, I'm going to leave. Okay. And that commitment, sometimes actually very practically is just by being very spot on the messaging and being very consistent over the years and just saying, not necessarily the same thing, but something that feels like it's being well thought and is consistent over time. And also it comes across, it comes also with staying in the same organization for a few years. One of the things that I think some of the foreign firms are struggling with, as I'm going a little bit beyond consulting here for a second, is that you have a lot of leaders who just come here for like 2 or 3 years, or let's say 5 years, give or take. And I understand that's part of the way that this large corporation is being run. Sometimes there's nothing wrong with that, but it's difficult, obviously, to say that there's a real strong commitment when someone just stays 2 or 3 years. I think it's quite important. In the question you were asking me also, how long you've been in Japan, I think it's an interesting point, actually, because having been in Japan for quite some time gives a certain level of credibility, actually, to some extent, to what we have to say, because we actually have been through a couple of different cycles, So I think commitment is definitely one of them. The second thing is, the retention issue is to come up with what are the missions, basically, So it's not about who's the next client, what's the next product, what is the next project, or so on and so forth. It's, what's the next mission? And the next mission is about, in the next 5 to 10 years, Mr., Mrs., what do you want to do for the firm? How do you want to contribute to the firm? What is the project, the mission that will actually make you extremely exciting? So someone wants to start a new practice. In consulting, we have a lot of practice, okay? And the history of consulting globally has been a little bit of a history of, creating IP, business IP, and then kind of deploying it around the world, including Japan. So in our operations in Japan, some people want to take these new missions about, I want to introduce this new IP or this new practice into Japan. That's a mission, all right? So making sure that, we have this kind of a mission on a regular basis to our people so that actually they feel like, actually they're almost like they change jobs without changing job, in many ways. And so having this sense of, the grass is greener in your new mission, not necessarily the next, employee that you're actually considering. So I think it's part of actually how to have this kind of a retention dialogue. But, we also understand that, as you said, very talented people will always have a great level of options, and that's fine. It's in many ways, the joke is always about, do you prefer to have talented people who may actually leave, or do you prefer to have non-talented people who actually decide to stay? I would actually prefer the first solution and working with talented people who may or may not leave and just having this dialogue with them rather than actually being stuck with non-talented people. So that's a bit what we are.
And you have a collective of senior partners in the company. So like with a lot of partnerships, you have a managing partner who coordinates with that group around strategic direction, key decisions, how to pay out the money, all that sort of stuff. So do you have that type of pattern at Bain, or is it more of a Marxist collective here?
So it's a partnership model, and that's nothing, I would say, new in a way in the consulting industry, because most of the companies are, except the one which has been bought out by larger corporations, but the one which are independent work on the partnership model, which is basically about, a group of people, leaders. And, for someone like a company like Bain, we're talking about 1,000 actually partners. So this is becoming a relatively large organization.
This is 1,000
globally.
global.
Globally, yes. And it's basically, it's a collective leadership model in many ways, which of course I would say the right level of delegation and governance, so that, obviously decisions are being made, because we don't vote, all the 1,000 of us, on each single decision of whether it would be even worse than the European Union. But it's basically a collective leadership model. It's also what we call a servant leadership model. So, and the imagery that we like is actually it's an inverted pyramid. It's not a pyramid when there's a guy on top and then boom, 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 and then it gets cascaded down. But it's more actually the leadership team is actually at the bottom. It's on this inverted pyramid, at the bottom of that inverted pyramid, and they have the responsibility to ensure that all the people above them, which is the base of the pyramid, get all the opportunities from a IP development perspective, client. They get all these opportunities open to them. So that's the way that usually consulting is being run, with, I would say, good success, because the track record is here when you look at the growth of this industry over the years. And that's basically how we are being managed.
Are you doing business with Japan? Do you really know how things work? Japan Business Mastery provides the answers. Do you have the right networks and know how to create them? Do you know how to get on the same wavelength with Japanese buyers? Do you know what being trustworthy looks like from the Japanese perspective? Japan Business Mastery is based on more than 30 years' experience in Japan and will become your go-to guide. Want to succeed in Japan? Buy Japan Business Mastery now. So you're in business, you're giving out advice for companies. It could be holistic, it could be very specific. If you're going to give some advice to someone who's going to be sent here to Japan for, say, 3 years, if they're lucky, maybe 5-year period, you've seen a lot of leaders, you've seen a lot of pattern recognition over the years, if you've mentioned it before. What would be some advice you'd give to someone to be an effective leader in Japan? What should they be thinking about?
So Japan, there's a couple of things that, I think I would, if they ask for my advice, I would just say. The first thing is that, about commitment, which I said earlier. People give you probably at the beginning the benefit of the doubt in terms of you coming to Japan because you got shown some strong capabilities and you come with very strong credentials. So I don't think the skill element is necessarily going to be questioned necessarily. But it's more about the kind of, it's almost like, are you in or are you out? Or are you almost out? Are you almost out after, but you haven't even been actually in the country. So the level of commitment, I think, is quite important. The second thing I would say is that, you need to define quite early what kind of a business principle you have. So in other words, what do you value between, freedom and accountability? What do you value between alignment and independence? This kind of a fundamental, I would say, business principles. And again, there's no right or wrong answer here, but being very, very clear about what you value the most, And honestly, I don't think there's anything wrong to say I value, alignment over independent decision-making process. There's nothing wrong about that, okay? But you have to be clear about this, right? The third thing is obviously you have to be quite mindful of the different layers of communication that's happening in a Japanese organization. It's interesting because I hear a lot of things about Japan organization being very silo, which is true to some extent. I don't think it's just about Japan, by the way, but that's another story. But when you look at this, and that's like the formal communication is very silo, absolutely. When you look at the informal communication, it tends to be non-silo, actually. It's kind of a silo breaker in many ways. So being, on the lookout for this kind of official communication on one hand and then the unofficial communication on the other hand I think it's quite important. The last thing I would just say is, I think sometimes Japan makes it a bit too easy for foreigners to come in here. What I mean by that is that, many foreign executives are actually extremely happy to be in Japan and extremely comfortable being in Japan in many ways because it's a relatively, people are extremely respectful. The work ethics here, obviously, here in this country is absolutely incredible. And so, there's always a time when after, let's say, 6, 9, 12 months, the new executives who just come to Japan after a year or so said, okay, well, I've got all figured out, That's, I know exactly what's going on. And then gets into some kind of a routine. And I would say that's a bit dangerous, actually, because you came to Japan for a reason, with a mission, obviously to change things, or with a change agenda. Never forget it, Don't be too much in love with Japan as well, one of the discussions that sometimes I get from some of my, some people who come to Japan is like, tell me everything I need to know about Japan so that I can be successful in Japan. And I'm sorry, that's not necessarily the right question to ask, because I think the question is more about, okay, who are you? What do you bring to Japan? How are you planning to contribute to Japan? And it's actually okay not to understand Japan to some extent. To some extent, of course, you have to understand, but you don't have to out-Japanese the Japanese because you will never out-Japanese the Japanese. Just like it's a lost battle. Just forget about it. And when I've seen Japanese actually executive working for foreign companies, sometimes actually they join these companies for a reason because actually they were looking for something different. They're not looking to work for a Japanese company. That's the reason actually they join a foreign company. So as a new leader, what kind of a mission would you give them, And I don't think the mission is about we're going to be as Japanese as your Japanese competitor. I don't think that's the mission is. So reflect on basically the heritage of your company, what is applicable to Japan, and then don't have too many questions. Just go for it.
Go for it. Any other final advice to someone? Should they learn Japanese when they come here?
I think they should learn Japanese out of personal interest. I don't think it's just out of a professional interest because, it's like the old adage, a little information is dangerous. A little Japanese is dangerous too, because it gives you into the mindset, into the thinking that you actually you understand. Now you got it. Okay, now I understand Japan. What it is? Well, no, my friend, you don't. Okay, and that's fine. So no, they should not necessarily learn Japanese, or at least they should do it out of a personal interest. No, look, I mean, it's. Talk to people who've been in situations before. I think, one of my fundamental rules of business usually is when you have a question, just ask 3 people you trust that question, and they give you 3 answers. And then you ask each of the 3 people you just talked to, introduce me to 3 other people. And then you got 9 people to talk to. And then after that, you got 27 people to know. So you probably get some pretty good advice from these 3, 9, 27 people.
Sounds like a good plan. Thank you. Well, this has been very interesting. Your industry is quite different from many of the guests I have who are in companies who have products or services which are not consulting. So it's interesting to see your model, how it works with the teams who are in there, how you have to invert the pyramid to make the system work, to have 1,000 partners around the world where you have a sort of democratic, pseudo-democratic, I suppose, decision-making model, which again is quite different. But very interesting. So thank you very much for joining me, Kenji. It's been very, very fascinating.
Thank you, Greg. Pleasure. Thanks.
So please join us again for our next episode of Japan's top business interviews.